Now we're going to come into some translation stuff again coming up here, and I'm also going to talk about a couple cultural things because 1 Samuel 18 has become a rather famous passage in the 21st century. It is a passage that is referenced a lot, and for all the wrong reasons, but it doesn't matter because when you want to read the Bible a certain way, you will read the Bible however you want. Isn't that true? And so that's why here what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a look at the Bible and we're trying to say, what is God trying to tell me, not what do I want to get out of this? And so we're going to take a look at it this week. And by the way, if you missed last week was David and Goliath. We talked about the story of David and Goliath, their confrontation, their clash, and what happened there. If you missed it, because a lot of people did, because the weather was horrible, please check that out, and you'll see it's not an underdog story. And the reason I want to emphasize that is because it's going to inform a lot of what's happening today, obviously, right? We're following along in a story. We're learning stuff about David. We're learning stuff about Saul. We're learning stuff about their confrontation or their conflict. And so it's going to start here in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1, where it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Now, I'm going to take a pause there, and this is probably the only time I'm going to have to make this point, and I hope it's the only time I'm going to make this point, is this is the verse that gets brought up again and again and again and again whenever people are trying to say, see, Jonathan and David were gay. No, they weren't. And this is very easily disprovable if you know any language other than English. If you can go back and look at the text, go back and look at the word for like the kind of plutonic love that we have for each other, the love that I feel for my church, the love that I feel for you guys, the love that I feel for my dog, right? That type of love is the word love that is being expressed here. The way that he loved David is in that manner. And I feel like I have to stop and make this point because it just keeps getting brought up. And again, it's because English is clumsy, not because the Bible is clumsy. English is clumsy, and the translations into English therefore seem clumsy. But guess what? When you read it in if you read it in Hebrew, this is very clear. There's nothing sexual about this statement whatsoever, at all. And it's so easily disputable, but unfortunately, most people will only, and understandably so. We have busy lives, we have things going on. Most of us don't have time to go back, look at the Bible in Hebrew, try and figure out what the words mean, try and work out for ourselves what that is. And so instead we read the English because that's what we understand, and that is totally understandable. But just understand that sometimes when you get confused about a particular passage, maybe that's a good time to ask questions instead of just making assumptions. That's teaching Claire the exact same thing. Ask questions, don't just assume. Get clarity, don't just think that you've got the right idea. Always double check. It's not a big deal. But this passage, because of this particular sentence and what's going to continue, it has become rather infamous in the church today. And a lot of churches even will use this to say, actually, see, this behavior is okay. But that doesn't make any sense with the rest of the Bible, right? Then we have a conflict with the rest of the word. And unless you're trying to infer that there's a major contradiction, then that does not fly. And of course it doesn't fly because, again, this is the love that I feel for a dog or I feel for my church or how I feel about pizza. That's that kind of love. Oh, I love pizza. And that's where that ends. There's nothing else weird about that. And so, verse 2, from that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. You'll remember that got pointed out last week, that even though back in chapter 16, Saul already had employed David to come and play the lyre for him to get the evil spirit to depart from him, right? David would come and soothe him. After he was done playing music for him, he would then go home. But now, from this day, from the time that he slew Goliath on, now he was in the full-time employment, he had a full-time status with Saul. He now lived at least in close proximity to Saul, and he was always there each and every day. And it said, and to which I say, the poor father, Jesse, is still waiting for David to return with assurance about his other sons. But he's going to have to wait, that poor man. And it says, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, why did the author include this? And again, this is one of these reasons why people will say, see, they were in love, they were lovers. No. The reason the author included this very specific detail, who is Jonathan? Jonathan is the crown prince. Jonathan, by legal claim, has every right to the throne. And yet, here is Jonathan symbolically handing everything he is over to David. Isn't that incredible? It's amazing. And, because you read this and you go, okay, who cares? What does it matter that Jonathan gave him a robe and a tunic and a sword and a bow? What's that matter? That's why it matters. It matters because it's showing us that Jonathan sees that God is with David, that David has been anointed by God. And we're going to, as we go further on in the story, you're going to see it's still not clear to them what exactly God is preparing him for, what exactly God is doing with him. But just as I said last week, where God was taking David his whole life to prepare him for that moment with Goliath, when he would stand off against a giant and take him down with a single stone, God has now begun the preparations of David for the rest of his life when he's about to become king. He has put him in close proximity to a king, and we're going to see that God has begun the rest of David's training to become a great leader, a great king, to be someone who commands respect and someone who earns the respect of his subjects. Verse 5, whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army, and this pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. And then it says, when the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, that's of course Goliath, the women came out from all the towns of Israel and met King Saul with singing and dancing and joyful songs, timbrels, and lyres. Now, I want to take a pause because I've heard a lot of, there's been a lot of commentary, and I've heard a lot of other preachers say verse 5, where it says he sent him on all these missions and he began to earn a high rank, right? We know that David stuck around in the army after this particular battle with David and Goliath. But here's the thing. That battle didn't end the war, right? And so people are saying, oh, there's some time travel here. They're saying, David kept doing well and he earned a high rank and he continued on. No. I want to be clear here. Yes, David did ascend through the ranks, but we're talking about from a footman just up to, being able to control a squad, be able to control I don't know any of the other terms outside of squad, but he would become in charge of more and more people as he was working. Because guess what? This was just the one battle. They would have pressed their advantage and not allowed the Philistines to continue to just get together, rally, and then come back and attack them again. They would have pressed the advantage while they had it. They would have continued on, because if you remember, there are 5 Philistine cities, and we only read about them going after the 2. And so this original battle would have ended, but the war continued, and so the battles went on and on. Saul sent him on more and more missions. He did well, and then they returned home. And then the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing. Now this was, of course, a very common thing. This happened all the time, because if you're one of the ladies who saw all the men go off to war, right, they were being conscripted to go off to war, you're waking up each day wondering, right? Because remember, we know it's been at least 40 days, because 40 days Goliath stood out there and was taunting the army of Israel. And each day these women were waking up, they were looking out and wondering what happened to their sons, what happened to their brothers, what happened to their husbands, what happened to their fathers. They worried about them. And then, of course, when they see them triumphantly coming back parading back across the land of Israel, there would have been a great celebration. That is a great cause for joy. Our sons are returning. Our husbands are returning. Our brothers are returning. This is a moment of celebration, and it would have been a great celebration indeed. And it says, as they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And this is the beginning of the tension that will forever exist between Saul and David. Because as we have mentioned many times before, as Saul became more and more powerful, as Saul remained king longer and longer, Saul became more and more self-absorbed, more and more caring about his image. Remember, he went and had that great battle, and although he said he wanted to worship God, he did stuff in his own honor, because that's who Saul had become. And so for Saul to hear this slight, or as the Bible puts it, this refrain, it says in verse 8, Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom, right? The people love David. Remember who David was? Before the beginning of the chapter before, he was just a shepherd boy. No one knew his name. No one knew who he was. But because he stepped up and he did what God had called him to do, because he lived up to the thing that God was preparing him for, suddenly now his name is being sung and chanted, and people are loving him, and they're going, wow, this guy David, he's incredible. He kills tens of thousands. Our enemies fall before him. What more can he get but the kingdom? Saul's thinking. And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on him. The next day, so this is after they've returned, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul, right? Much like we have seen before. And he was prophesying in his house. And while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did, let's take a pause there. Only because I want to address this prophesying thing. Prophesying, you'll know in the Bible, it's often used to say that he spoke for God, right? And so maybe you're wondering, why? Wait, okay, he's prophesying from God, but he's being tormented by God? Now, I do have a problem with how a lot of different pastors have interpreted this. They'll say things like, well, this must mean that he's just speaking. He's not actually speaking for God. And I often wonder what if this time his rant and raving, although was from God, was things like, woe is me, I'm going to lose everything, I'm going to lose the kingdom to David, what if he was just going off like that? We're not told exactly what he was saying, but what we do know is that he was saying something because he was prophesying. He was saying something. Now, was it from God or not? Again, we don't know because we don't know what he said, but I would lean more with, why would they suddenly change the way that a word is being used? It doesn't make any sense to me. To me, it feels like maybe he was prophesying, but he was prophesying something that wasn't popular amongst him. But it said Saul this time, as David was playing the lyre, as David was trying to soothe him, Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. Now, friends, but David alluded to him twice. Can you imagine this? You're in the service of the king. He's having a bad day. He's got a bad headache, whatever's going on with him. You're sitting there just playing beautiful music for him. And then, talk about the ultimate heckler. Then suddenly a spear comes flying across the room at you. I don't know about you. I'm getting off stage then. But apparently David stuck around for him to get a second shot. What does this tell us? This tells us something about David. David's respect for the Lord's anointed, even when the Lord's anointed begins to go off the rails. David has so much respect for God, has such a heart for God, that he says, I could never act against the king that you chose, O Lord. Saul was afraid of David. And I want us to remember this, him throwing the spear, because this is going to come up later. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. And so he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men. And David led the troops in their campaigns. And in everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all of Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in campaigns. Right? This, unbeknownst to Saul, is Saul sending David off to get trained to become the leader that he's going to be. He's learning how to lead. He's learning how to conduct himself in war. He's learning how to conduct himself with his enemies. The Lord is preparing him, and he's using Saul as his tool. Saul said to David, "Here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage." If you remember at the story of David and Goliath, that is what Saul had promised. Whoever kills Goliath, my oldest daughter is yours to marry. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that," right? I'm not willing to kill David because the people love him so much. I don't want to kill him and then the people turn against me. No. I'm going to let my enemies do it for me. But David said to Saul, "Who am I and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now, why is this significant? And I think it's because our culture has changed so much, we don't often think about what just happened. Why did David refuse? Remember, he killed Goliath. He had the right to claim her as his bride. Why did he refuse? Because even if he had that right, he had to pay a dowry. We don't often think about this today because we don't have a dowry. In fact, a lot of people today think that a dowry was like some sort of barter price you made with the father so that, so that the father essentially was paid for his daughter. No, that's not what a dowry was. What a dowry was is money that, yes, the man and the father agreed upon that went to the wife so that should the husband die or should the husband divorce the wife, that money is always hers and is there to help her in the case that she ends up widowed or if for whatever reason. So she would have this big sum of money, and being that, he's literally being wedded to a princess, it would have been a sizable amount of money that would have been expected for this princess. And David's saying, "What do you mean? I can't afford this. I couldn't possibly provide. I'm just a poor farmer. I'm a shepherd. I play you music, Saul. What do I know?" So he married her off to another man, and says, verse 20, "Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased, because he is crafty, and he says, 'I will give her to him,' he thought, 'so that she may be a snare to him, so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him.' So Saul said to David, 'Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law.'" And of course, this just shows us, again, the depths of where Saul has gone. He doesn't even care about his own kids at this point. He's just looking for whatever way he can to harm David, right? It's not about that Michal likes David and he's like, "Oh, this is wonderful. They'll like each other and get along great." No. It's all about, I want to make a trap for David because I hate him so much. We've talked about this before 2 chapters ago. This is what happens when we let that bottle up inside of us. It's funny because we tell people don't bottle up your emotions. I would say, look, it's not about not expressing yourself. This is about learning how to let go, learning how to forgive. Remember, David is the guy who had the spear hurled at him twice. Not only did he have the spear thrown at him, literally as he threw the spear, he said, "I'll pin you against the wall, David." He intended to kill him. And yet we see here, Saul ordered his attendants, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king likes you and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law.'" And they repeated these words to David. David said, "Do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and of little known." And when the servants told him what David said, Saul said, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride other than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was, of course, to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, he took the men, went out, killed 200 Philistines instead of the 100, brought back their foreskins. They counted out the full number so that David might become the king's son-in-law. And then Saul gave him his daughter in marriage. Now, first off, weird story, weird request. Fully acknowledge it's. Can you imagine? I was hearing a lot of other I like to listen to other people's takes. I like to read other commentaries and stuff, and it's true. Can you imagine being the poor guy that has to sit there in front of the king counting these things out? This is a weird story. But again, the point wasn't that. The point was he thought, I'm finally going to be rid of David. I'm finally going to kill him off. But why did David do it in the first place? I can't imagine. Imagine Brent. You're dating Lenina, you go over to the house, and then all of a sudden, John picks up a spear, hucks it at you. Somehow you get away. Are you going back to that house ever again? Every year. But again, this tells us something about David. David forgave Saul for all the evil that Saul keeps showing David. David says, I will not act against the Lord's anointed. I will serve him because he was chosen by God. I will do these things because Saul was picked by God himself. And he holds no bitterness. He holds no grudge, despite being given so many reasons to. We even say that to people, right? Well, you have every right to feel that way. Oh, yeah, I can understand your grudge. Guess what? That's not what the Bible shows us. The Bible shows us, you know what? We really shouldn't hold a grudge because then you turn into Saul. Right? Over time, that bitterness, that anger, that hatred turns into you lashing out and attacking people who are good to you because of jealousy. Forgiveness is the antidote. Verse 28, when Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became even more afraid of him, but he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. And the Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle because they weren't learning, apparently. And as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and he became well known. Again, I love this because it's somewhat complicated. We're definitely in a transition passage as it's showing us more and more about who it is, but this is definitely a character passage. This chapter is all about character. It's showing us the path. If you follow Saul's path of self-indulgence and self-seeking, which of course is the path of our world today, right? Just do what feels right. Do what's good. Do what you think is good. God made you that way, so it must be a good thing. Or you can follow the path of difficulty. It's much more difficult to do the path that David did. Quite frankly, I'm very fortunate to say that I've never had a spear thrown at me or had anyone shoot at me or anything like that. I'm glad that I am not having to live a life quite like David. But at the same time, I can see that the life of David, although difficult and dangerous, was one because God was preparing him for greatness. And as long as he was willing to remain faithful, as long as he was willing to adhere to the law, and as long as he continued to have a heart for God, right? Because I've said it before and I'll say it again, he was not a perfect man. He had some pretty major flaws. But he had a heart for God. A heart for God that meant that he trusted God. He took ownership of his mistakes. He remained humble and a good leader, despite making some pretty major mistakes. Right? There's two different ways to deal with problems when you do make mistakes. There's Saul's way, which if you remember when Samuel showed up after the battle, Saul immediately deflected. Well, actually, I know I'm in charge, but the men did it, so I guess it's their fault. Or you can be David. You know what? No, the buck stops with me. I am the one that's responsible. I'm going to be responsible for my actions, for the actions of my men, for the people that I'm responsible for. You can either bear the burden, take on the yoke, or you can keep trying to shrug it off. Personally, I prefer the yoke of Christ, right? Remember what Jesus said about his yoke, his burden that he places on you? Light is the burden, light is the yoke when you yoke yourself with Christ. Easy is that burden when you have a heart for God. Once again, we're looking at the life of David and Samuel, two polar opposites of characters, both chosen by God, but both men made very different decisions in the end. Again, it came down to the heart, not the hand. It's not about your works. It's about your faith. Who do you put your trust in? How do you want to live? How do you want to turn out? And remember that the actions we take today do have repercussions later on. Let's take ownership of our mistakes. Seek forgiveness from those that we need forgiveness from. And pursue God to the fullness of our ability, realizing that God is just preparing us for the next major challenge that's about to pop up in our lives.